Welcome to the 313 Men, Money, and Marriage podcast, the podcast where facts, logic, and reasoning are at the forefront of every conversation. I am your host, Andrew Johnson, and this week we're going to be talking about African Americans and the wealth gap. And before we get to that really quickly, I would just like to extend thanks to the audience who have reached out to me and, asked how I've been doing these past couple of weeks. It is greatly appreciated, and I am doing a little bit better. What's going on is that I had mentioned about a work colleague passing, and now I just found out a few days ago another work colleague that I knew when I worked in a different area but worked for the same agency also just passed. And what's frustrating about it, and what's giving me gets me a little bit bothered, is that those two individuals were younger than I was, and it also brings up the reminder that in the line of work that I was in, the average life expectancy is in the high 50s. So it's kind of frustrating to see stuff like that happen. So it just makes you think more about what it is that you're going through and what it is that you've been through and how to put things into perspective. It just makes things become a little bit more clear, and realizing that we don't have as much time on this planet as we think we do. So for the people who did reach out to me, thank you. But we're going to get right into this topic, and we're going to be talking about African Americans and the wealth gap. And the main thing here is, why would we even do this show? A lot of times when we're seeing things that's popping up on, whether we're in the social media platforms, we're seeing a lot of people looking like they have a lot of money. They're dressing in very expensive clothes, wearing $2,000 pairs of glasses, $1,000 pair of shoes. They're doing a bit, all kind of stuff. And if they got the money and they can afford it, fine. But when we run the numbers and we actually look at what people actually have, majority of them are faking it. And a lot of people are out here trying to get or reach the aspirations of what they're seeing on social media, not realizing that some of the people that you're seeing on there are grifting. They don't really have it. Some of them are straight up scammers, to be honest with you. Not all of them, but some of them are. So you have to be very careful with that. But I want to explain that to people. This behavior, some of these things that you're seeing, is creating even a bigger wealth gap than what we are actually, what you'll actually see as we go through some of these numbers. The main reason why there is a wealth gap with the African American community and other communities, whether it's Hispanic, Asian, or white, is a lot of people are uneducated about how to create wealth. Now, when we say wealth, it doesn't necessarily mean rich. It just means that you'll be doing much better off or be in a much better position than if you were, continually doing it the way you've been doing it. When this is the case, when you're uneducated about these types of things, you are susceptible to falling for scams and get rich quick schemes. And so that's one of the reasons why we want to do this particular episode. It seems that they can never get out of the hole when you keep falling for those scams. Ultimately, it's the path of least resistance. You try to find the quickest and fastest way to get from one point to the other. It's the path of least resistance. Now, what are the numbers saying? As I mentioned last week, even though that really wasn't an episode, I just want to say 54% of Americans read at about a 6th grade reading level or below. 21% are illiterate. So with that being the case, many of them have to rely on people telling them what to do, how to think, what's good, what's bad. And that's why they're so susceptible to some of these things, because they're not able to comprehend, even when they can read in some situations, comprehend what it is that they're actually reading. So that's the problem that they're running into. A friend of mine was selling some bulk products a while back, and to which he stated the more you bought, the more points you would accumulate. And I basically explained to him that this is sort of a scam. It's sort of a MLM, multi-level marketing thing, with a company you probably have heard of before. But he was insisting that it wasn't. And why was he insisting that it wasn't? Because somebody told him that what he was doing was legit, even though it would be very easy to prove that it wasn't. So what are the stats telling us pertaining to African Americans and wealth? The median Black American's wealth basically is about $44,000 compared to white households. That's Black households. White households, it's about $285,000. So basically what that means is for every $100 held by a white family, black families hold about 15. Home ownerships for blacks are at about 44%, where whites, they're about 73%. How does the education play a role into this? Education Black American levels have risen more recently. However, there are few opportunities for those high value type jobs. So we are getting more education. We are getting more educated, but the opportunities aren't always there for us, even though we are getting more educated. Debt. Black families carry a higher level of debt relative to income, particularly student loan debt relative to income. Much higher level. 70% of white and Asian households were either in the upper wealth tier, where only 45% of blacks were. So we say either they were, basically this is saying that they're either middle class or upper middle class, where blacks is about 45%. Black households only 9% earn 9.4% between 75,000 and 100,000. So basically, the average black household, only 9.4% of them earn between 75,000 and 100,000. Now, a lot of times when I had said this in the past, we were talking about dating standards and how people were wanting men who make $100,000. But most black households are making less than $75,000 a year. These are households, it's not individuals. So that just proves that you're chasing after a very small percentage of men because there's not that many. Emergency savings. Only 38% of black households have sufficient emergency savings, at least 1 month of income, compared to 57% of white households. Very small amounts. Blacks have a big gap pertaining to lack of access to capital. And why would that be the case? This is more geared towards business ownership, entrepreneurs. We've seen a lot of that grow in our community, especially among women. However, the access to capital is still a problem. Certain lenders may consider loans to African Americans to be risky. They're more susceptible to high interest rate lenders. That's why you see a lot of these high interest rate lender places tend to be in our community. They're charging outlandish interest rate, very, very high, not fair to, most people. I mean, the rates are so high that you can't even, it'll take you forever to pay them back. And that's part of the plan. They want to keep you in the hook for debt. And there are a couple reasons for this. Obviously, having a good credit score helps, but not everyone who is going into business and entrepreneurship may have that already in place. So because of that, they have to make decisions. They literally have to make decisions where they will have to borrow at a much higher rate, which puts them behind the competition because the competition borrowed the money at a lower rate and will have to pay back less. That's more money they can put back into the business or into their pocket, depending on the business that they're in. So lack of access to capital is very, very prominent in our communities. It's not something that we're not familiar with because we get a lot of these people who do that. There are also a lot of those places hover around military installations, areas like that, where there's a lot of younger people who are more susceptible to wanting to borrow money at a high rate. All of that stuff matters, so it's a target. Certain groups, young black men, young Hispanic men, are being targeted for high interest rate loans. So when they do decide to get into entrepreneurship or they do decide to get a job that they can maybe work in a career and they have an outstanding debt that they might have fallen behind in, some of these jobs do financial background checks. And when they see that, they cannot get hired. That's some of the reasons why our net worth tends to be lower because of some of these factors. And lastly, it's just good old fashioned racism. Some people just they don't lend, or it's not necessarily the lenders, but the system in and of itself of racism makes it very difficult sometimes for certain groups of people to move up the chain because they're too much of a risk. What banks would call it a risk, what other people who might think they have a good business idea but may not want to invest in it, whereas someone else could come up with a similar idea but not be Black or Hispanic, and they might get the funding. So just it's a lot to that. I mean, there's that's like venture capitalism and stuff like that. There's a lot to it, but it does play a role in how we are put in these situations. As far as this wealth gap is concerned. What is the importance of retirement savings? Retirement savings is very important. I preach this when I do a seminar into our communities, and I do it all the time when I talk about the importance of the decade of your 20s. I've actually done 2 podcast episodes on the decades of your 20s. The second episode I ever recorded was about the decade of your 20s. It's not just important for men, it's also very important for women. And it's not just important for women for dating and marriage and stuff like that. It's also important for them for their careers as well. And I stress this all the time. That's the decade that you kind of got to get right, because if you don't get it right, you're going to be playing catch up the rest of your life. So that decade of your 20s is very, very important. And the information that I'm going to give you here basically came from the AARP. And it just simply says, from age 51 to 64, the lowest income third for whites was $57,000. However, for blacks, it's only $12,800. That's the lowest income third. The middle income third, whites have about $93,000 in retirement, where blacks only have about $35,000. The highest income third, whites have about $291,000 in retirement, where blacks have about $139,000 in retirement. Now here, this is something that I want to talk about pertaining to these numbers. Sometimes what happens is, even sometimes when blacks and African Americans have a decent job, they're susceptible, they're skeptical of the stock market. They're skeptical of it because they might have seen the money go up and down before, and they saw people lose some money. So they tend to put their money in more safer investments, what they deem to be safe, but they don't draw that much interest. But they can do it in a balancing. There's a balancing way to do this, where you can have some exposure, some of your assets exposed to the stock market, and some are exposed to, say, a bond market or the REIT market or something along those lines. And I've had these conversations with colleagues in the past, and I explained to them the importance of balancing and having what we call asset allocation. You don't have to have all your money tied up in stocks, but you can balance it out to where maybe it'd be a 60-40, 50-50, 70-30, somewhere along those lines, to where you can get the return necessary. Because your money, your dollars, especially when you're in your 20s, 30s, and 40s, your dollars, most of the money that you have is coming primarily from your labor. You going to work, earning a check, things like that. Well, it takes time for your dollars to do what they need to do. They're like soldiers. They're long-term soldiers. And the earlier you put them to work, they will work and work and work until the day you die. So that's the advantage of putting that money in the stock market to an extent. Make sure that you have something going there, because you want those soldiers to work. You want them soldiers to grow. Historically speaking, the stock market has returned anywhere between 10 to 12% over the past roughly 100 years. Doesn't mean that it's going to do that in the future, but it is an indication to where we might be going. It's, you can always tell. And let's just say it doesn't get that high of a return. Let's just say it gets to 8%. Well, if it's 8% is better than 2 or 3%. Real estate generally does about 3 or 4%. Gold generally does about the same. So the best asset that you can do for long-term investment would obviously be the stock market, because the return is going to be higher over the long term. If you're looking for short-term investment, no. But while you're working, during the time that you're working, you need to be accumulating wealth. This is the best time to do it. And the best way to do it, an easier way to do it over the long term, would be to put your money in an asset that can accumulate over the course of time while you're working. So by the time you stop working, you'll have a nice nest egg that you can essentially live off until the rest of your life. So that's the importance of that. So a lot of times what I've been finding out when I've been talking to African Americans in the community is that their portfolio asset allocation is not aggressive enough for their age. Some people are putting, sometimes they're putting 90 or 100% of all their money in bonds, when bonds were getting like 1% and 2%. And so you have to kind of explain to them that that's not, in your best interest to get that low of an asset allocation, get that low of a return on your money, basically. So those are the types of things we have to educate our community on. And it's easier said than done because a lot of people are so set in their ways, and a lot of people are fearful that something bad would happen to their money by putting it in some of these investment things. I can give you a few examples. When we had some of the worst periods of time in the stock market and what happened, how long did it take to get your money back and all of these different things. But the key to investing in the market is to consistently do it on a monthly basis or a bi-weekly basis or a weekly basis. But if you're consistently contributing to the market, the prices fluctuate, you're paying a lot less. You're paying a lot less when the market is down, meaning that the price is like buying something on sale, and then when the price goes up, you're not buying as much. So that's the reason why you want to have some of those things come into you want that to come into fruition when you're investing. The types of jobs that you have for African Americans does play a role. Some jobs that African Americans get don't even offer 401k plans or pensions. Black Americans age 65 and up rely more on Social Security for retirement and are twice as likely to live in poverty. Now, to put a perspective on Social Security and what that basically is and how that works, Social Security has a bunch of benefits to it. However, it is meant to be sort of a floor, and a floor to prevent you kind of from falling into poverty if you worked all of your adult life, because you're guaranteed something. So essentially, Social Security is a government pension. And when I say government pension, you pay into the FICA tax, and the government matches what you pay. And what ends up happening is when you retire, you get a certain dollar amount. The longer you wait to retire, the higher the number generally goes. So that's how that works. Regardless on what the side of political aisle you think, well, you think it's going to go away. You hear things with a Ponzi scheme. All of that's not true, but it is meant to be that floor. So if you have a job that has a 401k, that's another place where you will be withdrawing and getting money out for retirement. A third wheel for you could also be if you set up a Roth IRA and maybe contributed some of that money, certain smaller dollar amounts, into that over the course of years. So by the time you retire, you'll have another nest egg to pull from. The problem is Black Americans don't have that. We need financial literacy in our communities. Now, I know of a few people who are out there doing all that they can to try and reverse this trend. Unfortunately, there's just not enough of them. And so that's where we're running into some of the issues. We're not educating our community on proper financial literacy. And if we had that and we showed people, because I've done it before, you see the light bulb go off in people's head. They were totally unaware that some of these things could happen. What are the reasons why African Americans face a big challenge in savings for retirement? There's several, and we're going to go over them as we get ready to wrap up. But before we get to that, I just want to talk more about the financial literacy real quick. When we're talking financial literacy, it's not about knowing how everything, all the ins and outs work. A lot of times when I was talk to people in the community about some of these subject matters, they would always go on the assumption thinking that it's what they saw on CNBC and all that stuff. They said they just don't understand it. It just seems too complicated. And I explained to them, you don't have to know any of that stuff. What you're seeing on there, if you're going to sit there and try and use that as a bellwether to study some of these things, you're going to be making a huge mistake. That's not what it's about. It's about knowing where to put your money and having discipline to consistently invest over the course of time as you're working. So the more you're working, the more you consistently invest, you'll get a good outcome, a positive outcome over the course of the long term. Whether you work 25 years, 30 years, 40 years, just depends on how long you work. So that's very, very critical. So when I say that financial literacy aspect, we need more of it in our community to explain how investing works, where they should be putting their money, not necessarily, just the investment vehicles. Like many people aren't even aware of what a Roth IRA is. They don't even understand. They don't even know that. They might have heard of the term, but they don't know exactly how it works. And trying to communicate this to our community is one of the most difficult things we seem to be having right now. And it's the reason why we're so far behind in that wealth gap. What are those reasons why African Americans face big challenges in savings for retirement? The very first one is Black workers are generally paid less, 76 cents for every dollar earned by a white worker. 43% of African Americans have annual income under $25,000 a year. Lower income also reduces the future for Social Security payments. Now, this is very, very, very important. What do we mean by that? If we got almost half of our community earning $25,000 or less, they can't contribute as much into the Social Security pot. Remember, they're taking 6.5% of your check out. So that's 6.5%. If you're only making $20,000 a year, isn't going to be that much. But the more you make, the higher your Social Security check will be in the long run. Because what Social Security does is they take your top 35 years of earnings, or let's say 420 months of earnings, and they add it all together to determine how much you get. So the more you make, your Social Security check will be based upon how much you earned over the course of that time. That's how that works. So the higher dollar amount that you earn, it gets averaged all together. Now, here's the beautiful thing. They take your highest 35 years. So if you started working at, say, 18 years old, and you work to 60, that's 42 years of working. Well, your bottom years of earnings fall out of the matrix, out of the formula there, and you get to earn. They take your top 35 years of earnings to determine how much you're going to get. So the more you make, the better off you are. Well, if we only have 43% of our community making $25,000 a year or lower, there's no way their Social Security check will be large enough to basically take care of them in retirement. That's why they're more susceptible to living in poverty when they're retired if they're only earning a Social Security benefit. Our unemployment rate is higher. It's double that of white workers. Racial discrimination plays a role into it. Where the jobs are, the opportunities. Sometimes if we as African Americans live in inner cities, you got mass transit issues. There's some cities where the mass transit doesn't even go to some of the locations where the jobs are compared to where African Americans live. So that creates another problem and a dilemma. And so these are things that we have to, again, go over, look through, and see how can we get through that point of it? How do we get over that hurdle? Because that is a hurdle. Black workers are less likely to receive retirement benefits. I believe it's like 42% to 58% for whites. The U.S. Census Bureau, 53% of full-time Black workers are enrolled in a workplace plan, which is good. Compared to whites, though, it's at 67%. So nearly 2/3 of whites, about 1/2 of Blacks. Private sector pensions are increasingly rare. There's not that many of them. There's only about 11% of the private sector has a pension plan. So that defined pension plan where you used to get a check after you retire and you collect a check as a pension, that's like 1 in 10 jobs that's in the private sector even have that. So that goes away. Fewer Black households own homes, as we discussed earlier. There's another reason why. Black families are less likely to inherit wealth. Here's a big one. Only 8% of Black families inherit wealth. Less than 1 in 10. 28% of white families inherit wealth. Those numbers don't have to necessarily be big, but they are important. Because inheriting wealth is very, very critical if you want to, pass on what you hear, generational wealth. What we call generational wealth. So that plays a role into it. Black families have saved less for emergency savings. White families have about $12,000 saved up for an emergency. This is the median number, where Black families have about $2,000. You see this gap. We talk about the wealth gap. We're behind. The best solutions to the problem is educating ourselves through financial literacy. There's a lot of good books out there. I mentioned them in the past couple of episodes. Two that I'll mention again, just based upon the stock market, if you want to learn some basics about the stock market. And literally, if you read just these two books, you're going to know about more than half what you'll need to know when it comes to investing. The first one was by John Bogle. It's called John Bogle on Mutual Funds. John Bogle was the founder of Vanguard, the Vanguard Mutual Fund. He passed a few years back, but he wrote several books. And that one on mutual funds is a really good book. It's a really good way to, it gets you a good understanding, and it's written well. So it gets you a good understanding of how mutual funds work. And mutual funds are just a series of stocks. Again, that's the stock market. And they invest in different types of companies, but they have multiple. So there might be 100 or 200 different companies in one mutual fund. And the other one, which I mentioned before, also was A Random Walk Down Wall Street by Burton Malachi. He was a Princeton professor who wrote the books a multitude of years ago, but it is still relevant to this day. So if you read just those two books, you'll probably know more than half what you will ever need to know when it comes to investing and, where to invest or how to invest. And just those two puts you in the game where you'll have a basic knowledge and understanding of what it is that you need to know. 2 books. That's all you got to read. Problem is, in our country, almost half of our country doesn't even read any books throughout the course of a year. And so these are some of the reasons why they're staying or being left behind. The more knowledgeable they are, the less likely they're less likely they are to fall for these susceptible. They're less susceptible for some of these scams, basically, like we talked about earlier. Well, we're going to wrap up. I hope this episode was educational for you, and I hope you got something out of it. We do have a YouTube channel. In this particular episode, I'm going to pop up on the YouTube channel at some point because I generally like to put the educational ones, more educational based, on the YouTube channel to help people out. The YouTube channel is called the Men, Money, and Marriage Hour. If you haven't been there yet, go like and subscribe to help us get further along in that algorithm. We also have the website where there's always a link in the show notes. You click on that link, it'll take you to the web page, and on the web page you will be able to sign up for the email list. We're going to be starting a newsletter soon. Like I said, we're going to be making some changes to the show, and anyone on the email list will have access to that newsletter, which will probably be released once a month. And we'll be talking about similar topics like this. I'm going to have a couple of my guests actually write little articles on there as well. So that's a big plus for you if you're on the email list. You'll get information that I don't necessarily talk about on the podcast itself. And there's an Instagram page. It's called Jesus, I forget sometimes. 313 Men, Money, Marriage, all one word. Men, Money, Marriage. The 313 Men, Money, Marriage, all crammed together, one word. And you'll see clips of previous episodes and pictures of previous guests. So, with that being said, until we meet again, we are out.